Hello, welcome to Big Picture Monday. I'm Cali Black. I'm back, you guys, and I realize this actually doesn't mean anything to like most of you, but because I was still creating videos ahead of time, but I am back actually for reals this time. My little baby girl Piper is 6 weeks old now. Crazy. Feel like I just had her. We are adjusting to 3 kids just fine over here. You know, some days I'm like, this is fine, we're all good, and other days I'm like, this is mass chaos, why are we doing this? But no, all in all, things are going great, starting to get more sleep, but I'm so excited to be back doing Big Picture Mondays, like actually at the time when they're ready to be published, and I'm excited to talk about the book of Judges this week. Things get crazy, you guys. Last week we flew through Joshua's life, and now we're gonna go through Judges, and this week we're gonna fly through 200 years of history and study a whole bunch of people. So to be honest, about now is when these videos become even more valuable, because we're not just studying Moses for a while, and we're not even just studying Joshua for 1 week. We're going to talk about a whole bunch of different people today. So don't forget, if you find these videos useful, sharing them, commenting on them. You guys are seriously so good at this already, so please keep doing what you're doing if you're able to, and if you haven't yet, sharing them with people that you know and saying how helpful it is. It's always great to just be able to help people understand a little bit more what's going on. Okay, this week we are studying Judges, chapters 2 through 4, 6 through 8, and 13 through 16. If you remember last week, we studied Joshua's life. The Israelites are in the promised land. They made it. Woohoo! They've conquered Canaan. They've been divided up into where their tribes are actually going to be living, and they've settled down, and they're starting to live. And then at the end of last week, we learned Joshua died. Well, after Joshua died, the Israelites did not stay as righteous as they should have been. And so that's when we get into this 200-year time period that the book of Judges covers. Now, I want to talk about the Judges, because when I say Judges, I'm going to bet that most of us think about the Book of Mormon definition of Judges, right? In the Book of Mormon, we're pretty used to this idea that the reign of the judges, like the judges were their government system. There were small groups of people that had, you know, judges over them, and then there was like the chief judge over all the land. Like this was their government system, right? It was judges. In the book of Judges, that is not really the type of judge that we're talking about. Looking at all the evidence that we have as to what these judges did, there's very little evidence to show that they had anything to do with actually like judging people like in a government sense, like settling a dispute locally or anything like that, or any sort of governing. Really, what I want you to think of when you talk about judges this week is to think of a military leader that God called. Okay, so most of the time they're doing military things. These are military liberators, because you're going to see Israel is falling captive to lots of different people. And so they're coming and they're liberating the Israelites. But there's also a little bit of a spiritual element as well, because God is clearly calling these judges. So we don't have, at this point in time, there's not like a centralized government over all of Israel. They really have divided into their tribes. They're just kind of doing their own thing at this point. There's not a king. There's not a president over all of Israel. They are just kind of doing their own thing. So we're going to read about different judges that are called at different points in time. Sometimes they're overlapping with other judges because maybe they're with a different tribe. They're over a different set of people. And also when we talk about Israel being taken away captive as slaves to the Midianites or whatever, we're not talking about all of Israel. It's not like all of the children of Israel are constantly being conquered and taken as slaves at the same time. We're really talking about little tribes or groups of these Israelites, although that's not really clarified in the scriptures. So when you see that like Israel's being conquered by a group of people, just think, okay, but at this point in time, it doesn't mean all of Israel. It just means there's a group or maybe a few tribes together who are being conquered. Sometimes we find out who those tribes are, but a lot of times it just says Israelites, and we kind of have to read between the lines, okay? We're also going to talk about this cycle that happens over and over. Once again, referring to the Book of Mormon, we know about the pride cycle in the Book of Mormon, right? in the book of Judges, I feel like, and really for the next few months even that we're going to read here, there's kind of this cycle of, okay, we have Joshua, we have the great prophet, and we're all being righteous and everything's all good. And then Joshua dies. Ding. That sets off the people becoming less righteous and not turning to the Lord. And then bad things happen. They're usually captured by a group of outside people. And then once they've done that, they start crying to the Lord. They start repenting. They start asking for help. The Lord raises up a judge, this, military leader, right? Who then comes and saves the people. And then as long as that judge is still alive, they're still righteous. And then as soon as that judge dies, ding, they start to become less righteous again. This is this cycle, the judge cycle. That's what I'm going to call it, that we see over and over again. Okay, so let's talk about actually what we're reading about in these chapters this week. The reading is split up into thirds, and it kind of fits naturally. In chapters 2 through 4, we're going to talk about a bunch of different judges. In chapters 6 through 8, we're going to focus on a judge named Gideon. And in chapters 13 through 16, we'll focus on a judge named Samson. And that's what we get to focus on. So we skip chapter 1. Chapter 1 of Judges just is reminding us that there are still Canaanites in the land. I know it's like Israel conquered Canaan. It doesn't mean that they literally kicked all the Canaanites out, though. And in chapter 2, where we start reading, we see why this is a problem. And this is the Israelites start to worship false gods. They start to worship the gods of the Canaanites who are still in the midst of them in their land, which is no bueno, of course. And in chapter 3, now we start going into this judge cycle, as I mentioned. Hopefully that makes sense. And so we see the Israelites, they're falling away. They're starting to marry the Canaanites, which, remember, they had specifically been asked to stay a separate people and to not marry with the Canaanites, but they did. And so as a result of that, they are captured. They fall into captivity. And so the Lord raises up a judge. The first judge we talk about is Othniel. Othniel comes and saves them, and they are then righteous for about 4 years. They have this righteous period. Okay, then they fall into not being righteous anymore. They get taken away as slaves. We have another judge named Ehud who is called up, and he saves them in a very dramatic battle against the king, and they're all righteous and everything's all good. And then they fall back into the same cycle, and the Lord calls up another judge, Shamgar. This is all in the same chapter, you guys, really. And Shamgar saves them, and then they have a period of righteousness. So once again, we're starting to see this cycle. And then in chapter 4, we get to see another cycle, and I really like this one. The Israelites have been sinning. They get captured. They fall into captivity through the Canaanites. Okay, so they're the biggest, strongest presence that's immediately right there in their midst. So this is not good. They have been in bondage to the Canaanites, and it's been 20 years. And so there is a judge named Deborah. That's right, we have a female judge, and she is called up, and she seems to have another judge who works alongside with her. It's not that these judges were all literally by themselves, named Barak, and they together are asked to go and free the Israelites from the bondage of the Canaanites, which is a huge task. And Barak was going to go and lead the troops, but he said, I'm not going unless Deborah is going with me. He knew that Deborah was the one who had that spiritual foresight and needed to be able to push them forward. So Deborah and Barak, they go and they lead the Canaanites to victory against lead the Israelites to victory against the Canaanites, which are this huge military presence with tons of chariots and everything. And then the chapter ends with this really interesting story about Sisera. Sisera is like the captain of the guard of the Canaanites. And so he realizes they're being defeated, right? And so once he knows that, he runs away and he finds like the tents of where a lot of the military leaders are camping. And he goes in and he finds one of the wives of one of the military leaders, and her name is Jael, Jaal, and she invites him into her tent and makes sure he's all comfortable and lets him go to sleep. And then she kills Sisera because she knows exactly who he is. And as soon as she's done this, she goes and finds Barak, the judge, and says, I killed the military leader, and this kind of like seals in stone, like they have defeated Canaan. It's really this huge military victory that Deborah and Barak and Jael are able to accomplish, all working together and doing their own part. So kind of a fun story. Okay, so that's the first little third chunk that we study. Chapter 5 that we skip is interesting, though. It's a song, a poem that Deborah and Barak wrote about their victory. Okay, chapters 6 through 8, we get to learn about the judge named Gideon. So once again, we're in this cycle. Chapter 6, Israelites. Make sure I'm talking about the right group of people. The Israelites are in bondage to the Midianites. They're a group of people who lived outside of Canaan, but they're in bondage to them. It's really bad. It's not looking very good. And so an angel comes to Gideon and calls Gideon to be a judge. And Gideon is not quite sure that he really is the one who should be the judge, but he accepts this, and he eventually builds an altar and destroys an altar that the people had made to a false god as well. So he's able to convince everyone else that he really is a judge. It seems like a lot of people knew Gideon from like growing up with him, and they're like, wait, Gideon? Gideon's the judge? What? You're just a normal guy. And so Gideon had to perform some miracles in order to show, and he had the Lord working with him to show, like, no, this is my calling. I have now been called to this new position as a judge. And so in chapter 7, we see Gideon starting to get his army together. And so he gathers thousands of men together, and people are like, all right, let's go conquer the Midianites. We're ready to go. So Gideon gets all his people. And the Lord says, if you defeat the Midianites with all the thousands of men you have right now, no one's going to actually turn to me, because it's not going to seem like a miracle that you defeated the Midianites. So the Lord has Gideon go through 2 different selection processes that totally weed out a whole bunch of the men that were all like, yeah, let's go to war. They're all now being sent home. And Gideon is left with 300 people. He started with thousands. He's left with 300. And the Lord is like, yep, now you're good. Now go defeat the Midianites, which I'm sure was probably pretty daunting. Now Gideon finds out that the Midianites are actually afraid of him. Like, his reputation has kind of started to precede him. Like, they know, ooh, Gideon's coming. We've got to get prepared, because we know he's getting a big army together, and we know Gideon's a good leader. So Gideon finds out about this, and he's like, okay, I've got 300 men. What am I going to do? So at nighttime, he decides to split his 300 men into 3 groups of 100 men each. And they each go into different mountains that are surrounding the Midianite camp. And at the same time that night, or they start at different times, but eventually all at the same time, they each blow their horns and shout as loud as they can. Now, the thing is, at that time, the people who would blow the horns and shout were just a very small group of the army. And so the Midianites hear 300 men blowing their trumpets and shouting, and they think, oh, there are thousands of men that are behind that call. And so they freak out, they immediately desert and run away. And in the meantime, Gideon is then able to pursue them. And then it ends in chapter 8 with Gideon and his armies continuing to pursue. There are multiple Midianite kings. So Gideon goes and kills all of the Midianite kings, and they are freed from the Midianite rule. And Gideon comes back home, and everyone is like, Gideon, you're awesome. You've got to be our king. You've got to be our ruler. And Gideon gives this little testimony of, listen, God is our ruler. God's our ruler. Let's turn to him. I am not going to be your ruler. That's not for me. And that's where his life ends. And they have peace. They have a great amount of peace in the land until Gideon dies, and then they immediately turn back to their wicked ways. Okay, let's go to the last third. The chapters we skip just cover a few more different judges, and we end chapters 13 through 16 talking about Samson, which I feel like is probably the most popular story from this week, but also maybe sometimes the most misunderstood, or we only hear like, yeah, there's something about his hair. I know that. I feel like that's kind of where I was coming into my understanding of this. But the beginning of his story is really fascinating. In chapter 13, we learned that the Israelites, or at least the Israelites in the area, were enslaved to the Philistines. Okay, the Philistines lived like right on the water. They were right to the west of where the Israelites were. And so they were enslaved to the Philistines. And there was a woman, we don't know her name. We know her husband's name was Manoah. But there's this woman, and she was barren. She was not able to have kids. And she's out in the field one day, and an angel comes and says, "You're going to have a son. You're going to have a son, but you need to make sure that you do not drink any wine and you're not partaking of meat. And then you need to raise this son as a Nazarite his whole life. And then he will then become a great judge and free the Israelites from the Philistines." And she says, "Wow, yes, of course I'll do that." And she runs back inside and she tells her husband, Manoah, "Guess what happened? Guess what this angel just told me?" And Manoah is like, "Wow, I would like to have that witness as well." And so they both go out, and the angel appears again and says the same exact information to them, that this is what they need. They'll have a son, but they need to raise him as a Nazarite. Now, quick caveat, let's talk about what's a Nazarite, because if you're like me, if you hear a word that ends with "ite," like Israelite or Nephite or anything, Levite, I think it's a group of people that's like your identity that you're born into, right? That is not the case with Nazarites. So I just want to clarify what this is. The concept of a Nazarite was actually revealed to Moses back on Mount Sinai. We did not read the chapters about this because there was a whole bunch of stuff that Moses had revealed to him on Mount Sinai that we skipped. And so this was something that we skipped. But basically, becoming a Nazarite was a choice that you made for a certain amount of time. First of all, you had to be a man. And then secondly, you had to want to devote yourself to God to receive extra strength for a certain amount of time. So a lot of times men would become a Nazarite for like a few months or maybe a few years to really, it was like this sign of extra devotion. They would receive extra strength from God, this huge commitment that they would make. And then they would, return back to their normal life, having this beautiful experience with them of when they fully devoted themselves to God. Now, while you were Nazarite, you had 3 rules that you had to follow. Number 1, you couldn't drink any wine or any other grape products, which was very popular at the time. So that was a huge distinction that they had to make. Number 2, you could not cut your hair for the duration of the time that you're a Nazarite. And then number 3, you couldn't have any contact with someone who was dead, like physical contact. You couldn't like touch a dead body or something like that. Pretty easy rule to keep in my book, but maybe other people had to sacrifice to do that. Anyways, so those are the 3 rules to keep as a Nazarite. Like I said, this was like a temporary thing for virtually everyone. And so for Manoah's wife to be asked to raise her son as a Nazarite his entire life, this was huge. This was very unique, a very unique thing for them to be asked to do, and it took a lot of sacrifice, I'm sure. Okay, so just a little context on that. Okay, moving forward, chapter 14, the next chapter, we're skipping Samson's childhood. We don't know anything about that, and we now have grown Samson. He has fallen in love with a Philistine woman. Remember, the Israelites are in bondage to the Philistines right now. So his parents are not very happy about this, and it literally says that in the scriptures. But Samson goes forward with it. He is very strong due to his Nazarite status because he's never drank wine, he's never cut his hair, he's never had physical contact with someone who's dead. And so he kills a lion, and after he kills the lion, within the carcass, there's bees that come and make honey in the carcass of the lion. Then he goes to his wedding ceremony, and there's of course a big feast associated with wedding ceremonies, and while he's there, he tells a riddle to a large group of men that are attending the feast, and he says, if you have 7 days to try and figure out the answer to this riddle. And Samson's wife really wants to find out the answer to this riddle, and so she keeps asking Samson what's the answer, and he does not want to reveal it to her. And then he finally does, and the answer, I don't understand the riddle. Apparently I'm not up to date on my Israelite and Philistine humor, but anyways, the answer is the lion with the carcass, the lion carcass with the honey within it. I mean, it makes sense, but it's not humorous. I guess riddles are not supposed to be humorous too, from what I've learned, but riddles were really a big thing back then. Anyways, so Samson tells his wife the answer to the riddle. She turns around and tells the men before the 7-day period is over. Samson is not happy about this at all. And so he ends up killing those men, 30 of them. He kills 30 men. He then goes away for a little bit, and in chapter 15, he wants to come back to his wife. He had left his wife there, and his father-in-law comes out of the house and says, you can't see her, and she is married to someone else, which is... Obviously, there's a lot of ambiguity on what is appropriate or not at this time period, but for sure, getting married to someone else when you haven't terminated a marriage to someone else in the first place is a huge no-no culturally. Samson is so angry that he decides to burn all of the crops down in the area, and the other Philistines are like, what is going on? And they assume that it was Samson's wife and father-in-law who burned all their crops, so they go and burn the wife and the father-in-law. They then find Samson and they figure out, oh, it was actually him, and they pursue him. And there's actually a group of Israelites from the tribe of Judah who capture Samson and like turn him back over to the Philistines that are like, you can have him. You figure out what you're going to do with him. And so they take him, he's in bondage, and he calls on strength from the Lord. And with a donkey jawbone, he is able to kill, I just want to make sure I get my numbers right. He is able to kill 1,000 men. I'm getting ahead of myself. He's able to kill 1,000 men with the donkey jawbone, and then he goes and takes a drink at a well afterwards. And then our last chapter, chapter 16, he then falls in love with a woman named Delilah. Delilah is also a Philistine woman, and these Philistine lords are still like, we've got to get rid of Samson. He is too strong. Like, he killed 1,000 men with a donkey jawbone. We got to get rid of him. But they also know they can't. They have tried, and he's too strong. And so they go to Delilah and they say, look, we've got a whole bunch of silver here. We will gladly give you tons of money if you can tell us how Samson gets his power, and then we can defeat him. And so Delilah accepts the bribe, and she goes to Samson and she says, where do you get your power? Samson gives her lies 3 times. And each time that he tells her a lie, the Philistine lords come and try out that lie. So I'm not sure why Samson decided to eventually trust Delilah. And eventually he does tell her the truth and says, listen, I'm a Nazarite. I've been raised as a Nazarite my whole life, which means if you cut off my hair, I would lose all my power. And so that night, Delilah tells the Philistine lords, here's what's going on. She gets her big payout, cuts off the hair, and Samson is able to be captured by the Philistines. They gouge out his eyes, which was a very common punishment at that time. And then at the end of Samson's story here, he is tied up in a building that a lot of the Philistines are in, and Samson is clearly very emotionally beat down at this point as well, including physically beat down. And he decides to call on the Lord one more time. He's got a little bit of hair growth, and he calls on the power of God, and he pulls down the entire building, which kills 3,000 Philistines, including himself as well. Samson is also killed in this as well. And that is the end of his story. Samson's story is unique because we don't necessarily hear about a huge liberation that he made for the people, and so a lot of people believe we're missing a lot of his story, but basically the spiritual aspect, the spiritual side of it that we can pull out talks about his covenant. Staying a Nazarite his entire life is nothing to bat your eye at. Like, that is a huge commitment that he made, and the Lord clearly gave him a lot of physical power in exchange for that. And yeah, he also did some interesting things that are kind of interesting. So Samson's an interesting character to study this week. Okay, that's it. These are some of the judges. Like I said, this covers 200 years, and we're not covering all of it. We're just getting little snippets here and there. And then we don't even read the whole book of Judges. There's a few chapters at the end that we skip that basically just talk about how Israel itself is kind of starting to like fall apart. There's fighting within the tribes, and there's people making terrible choices within the tribes. So basically we're seeing as Israel falls apart spiritually, they are physically falling apart as well, which is definitely a theme the Lord wants us to see as we kind of move on to this. Okay, that's it. I think my spiritual guiding question this week, I love learning about Deborah, the judge. And one thing that she says to Barak is when he's being very fearful about going against the huge Canaanite army, is she bears her testimony that the Lord has provided a way for them. The Lord has already provided a way, and she may not even know that way. I don't know how much she knew at that point in time, but she had faith that the Lord, if the Lord asked them to do something, he was going to provide a way for that to happen. And so I want to think about in my life, with the things that I'm struggling with, the things that I feel like I'm drowning with, do I believe that the Lord has provided a way for me to actually come out successful? And if I do believe that, how am I letting that affect how I'm actually living and going about all my different challenges? Okay, it's so good to be back with you guys, even if it looks the same to you. I'm still just the face on the screen. But it's good to be back and sharing information about Judges. If you have any questions or there's a lot of kind of some weird stuff going on, leave them in the comments. I love being able to respond to questions. I've done a lot of research, tons more research than what I'm able to share in these videos. So I love being able to share what I know or do some searches, or I love also admitting, hey, we don't know the answer to that, but here are a few options. That's always fun too. Okay, have a great week this week diving into the book of Judges, and happy studying.